Fine.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So a very brief context before I introduce Stephanie and Malcolm. We had if you cast your mind back to just after the general election, we had a little bit of funding left over from the SURF fun times we had back then with that funding. And we thought, you know, I think in credit to our name drop Sarah Loynes from back then. She did a great job as part of this work. What can we do to increase the knowledge base, increase the help for decision makers on what the new government's going to look for? So we thought a dimension that transport planners don't often go into when they're talking about the relationship between rapid transit and intensification and new future bus networks is some of the actual economic benefits. They're often buried in business cases. They're not discussed in terms of the city shaping conversations they should be. So we thought it would be good to have a very small piece of work that's turned out to be one of the best things we've done, I think, just to, in some plain language and using some real life examples, just understand some of those value capture, rating uplift considerations, I think, that would help inform future decision makings and say, outside of the stuff we already know about, like emissions benefits and patronage benefits, there are some wider economic benefits to introducing rapid transit. So it's really to support that BRT network and that transition to a BRT network. So I'll stop there and I'll let Malcolm and Stephanie introduce themselves and their company, but we did manage to get KPMG, fresh from their work on the Auckland Light Rail scheme as well, to do a little bit of work for us in this space. They've already done a internal staff presentation to Hamilton City, where a lot of your staff attended as well, particularly those representing the Transport Working Group. And I did touch on this at an internal briefing at HTC last week. So I think you'll find it really interesting. It's a little bit of a new dimension to work we've done in the past. And Malcolm and Stephanie have got a little presentation that they'll run us through now, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. So Malcolm, can I hand over to you?
Yes, kia ora. We'll just test the audio and the screen sharing is working first.
It's very good, mate. Yes, thank you.
Excellent.
Kia ora, shall I kick us off? I'm Steph Ward, a partner here in KPMG's, we call it Infrastructure, Assets and Places. So a group of folk who have a background in developing and delivering major projects and in complex infrastructure. Some of us have kind of got more of an economics background and others have more of an engineering background. So it's quite a broad mix of skill sets in the team. But as Phil said, we were brought in to do a pretty rapid piece of analysis around funding and financing options for the BRT project, and drawing on the work that we'd done with central government, so particularly with the Treasury, Ministry of Housing and Ministry of Transport on value capture tools and looking across a really broad set of innovative tools that could be used for Auckland Light Rail. And so we used that as a starting point to think about what could be relevant in the Hamilton context. So what we're going to do today is just run you through our methodology and what we did and some of the interesting findings in a few of the case studies that we looked at. So we'll run through the analysis, but very happy to turn it into a bit of a discussion and take some questions at the end if that's helpful as well. So I might just hand over to Malcolm to kick us through the analysis.
Brilliant. So I'll start off with just discussing a bit around our scope in this work. So this is really presenting options for how to fund and finance bus rapid transit in the Hamilton and broader New Zealand context. We've taken a particular focus on value capture, given that has been discussed as focus for both the previous government and current central government. Our work is broken into three key sections. So impact on land values from bus rapid transit, which we largely focus on a literature review of global case studies of bus rapid transit. The second being development impact. So what do you see typically occur around bus rapid transit in terms of development, and how does that impact the rate space for both regional and city council? And then we bring that together in a what-if analysis that I will talk through a little bit more. It's also, as Phil sort of touched on, this piece of work sort of fits in amongst a couple of other pieces, including some more technical work around how existing infrastructure could be utilized, including bridges and key routes within the city that could be suitable to bus rapid transit, and this would all flow through to sort of a potential business case in the future. But the concept of bus rapid transit for Hamilton actually comes from the Hamilton Waikato Metro Spatial Plan, which I'm sure everyone in the room is quite familiar with. But I'll just touch on it lightly. So that's the 30-year spatial plan for the wider Hamilton urban area. As you are all no doubt familiar, there's high population growth projected, and the kind of metropolitan region could be over 500,000 by the early 2050s. The spatial plan sort of identified a preferred scenario for how that growth could occur. Now, that obviously isn't a locked-in future, but we took that as a starting point for thinking about the role bus rapid transit could play. So if 70% of the growth was to occur within the existing Hamilton City Council boundaries, and 75% of that within the existing urbanized area, which is kind of the scenario identified, we did some approximate calculations of an additional 60,000 new homes within that existing urban area. And that's just to accommodate that population growth. That wouldn't be accounting for any housing shortfall that probably exists currently. So accommodating that in a well-planned manner, bus rapid transit emerges as a solution to at least the transport capacity side of how are you going to enable that population growth, that urban development, and people to move around your city. The identified rapid transit corridors, which has come through some recent work, look to connect your key employment centres, key educational hubs, and the locations in between. And that provides a great opportunity to also provide for residential and commercial growth. So working from there, bus rapid transit, a little bit of a 101 of kind of what is it, and this is really important for the funding and financing conversation, is there's a bit of a distinction between busways, which refer to infrastructure, versus bus rapid transit, which is more about an all-encompassing system. And this flows through to the type or the scale of value uplift you would likely see. It also can impact patronage and various other things. For those of you familiar with the Auckland context, we have the Northern Busway, which opened in 2008 and was extended a few years back to increase the catchment, the length, and eventually the number of stations. We also have the Eastern Busway currently under construction and further ones planned. The way our busways currently operate are an open system. So this is where buses can come onto the road and use it to bypass congestion through the bus-only road, providing priority and no congestion. And that's generally described as an open system. So the North Shore busway doesn't actually run all the way to the city. It relies on some shoulder bus lanes and general traffic lanes to get all the way into the city. Bus rapid transit is actually a closed system, so closer to what you might think of when you think of light rail, heavy rail based or rail-based rapid transit generally. So you would have sort of off-board ticketing, boarding, alighting, kind of different style of stations. The vehicles only operate within that the busway itself, and therefore there's a different reliability. It's a different product, I think, is the way to think of it. But this ultimately flows through to the land value uplift. So what we did was a literature review. We looked across a couple of dozen case studies, and what we found was quite a range of value uplift to surrounding properties where bus rapid transit has been implemented. So the range there from about 3.7% all the way through to as high as 17%. And the scenarios or where this has occurred is really reflective of the level of infrastructure being put in, the type of service, and some of the wider context as well. We've got 4 case studies there on the slide, which we think are of particular note. So Auckland, one study found that, yeah, there was a 3.7% uplift on property values within 800 metres. Across the ditch in Sydney, the Liverpool to Parramatta Transitway, which is a little bit more of a closed system, found 11% within 400 metres. So that proximity potentially reflecting in a higher uplift. And then a couple more in South Korea and in the US. Now, this is just important for the value capture and potential funding opportunity to understand how the investment into the infrastructure and the services flows through to the surrounding neighbourhood, to the property owners there, and the benefit they get. So that can provide an opportunity to capture some of that value through tools we'll touch on in a couple of slides to help cover some of the cost of the infrastructure. So the next part is sort of around the development outcomes that you can get from enabling rapid transit and then undertaking upzoning to allow for higher density development. For this, we wanted to ground it in Hamilton case studies that you're all familiar with, that aren't sort of too abstract. We're not pulling in a case study from another city in New Zealand or overseas where you can't, directly take that and apply it to the Hamilton context. Instead, we wanted to look at recent development that you're all familiar with, to look at how a site may have been redeveloped and how that is flowing through to an increased rates take for the city council and for the regional council from that property. So many of you will be familiar with the new ACC office building just at the edge of the city centre. That saw almost a 5-fold increase for the regional council in terms of rates take and a higher one again for the city council. We've seen similar in the residential space as well. So some of you may be familiar with the apartment block at the bottom right there, which is just a couple of blocks north of the bus station. And that saw sort of a single level commercial building replaced with a 5-level apartment building, only 21 units. But the increases kind of speak for themselves in terms of rates take. So 700 for the regional council up to 18,000. So that's a little bit of a flavour for what we want to sort of see around the rapid transit and alongside upzoning. What we then did was we took those findings from the, both development and then the literature review around land value uplift to say, develop some what-if scenarios. It's important to note that these are not projections. These are sort of scenarios to say, in a low growth scenario, we could expect something in this ballpark. In a higher growth scenario, we could expect something in this ballpark for rates for the regional and city council. These are, of course, subject to wider economic conditions. If we had a sustained period of no growth, the population growth in Hamilton wasn't occurring in the way that it thought, then you would probably be less likely to see this develop. But this analysis is sort of grounded in 3 key components. So one is around the percentage of land value uplift. So we've got the range there from 2% through to 6%, potentially slightly conservative if you looked at our literature review, but we wanted to provide some caution here because there is little literature in this space, particularly in the New Zealand context. The next component to this calculation is the number of properties developed or the percentage within that catchment of the bus rapid transit. Again, we went from sort of 5% over a 10-year period through to 15%. We kind of did some rough examinations of areas which have been upzoned in Auckland to understand what percentage of properties were developed in those suburbs? Like, what's the change you could expect to see with some reasonably high population growth and enablement of urban intensification? What's the ballpark there? So we've got 3 different scenarios for that. And then applying what's the increase in capital value on that property from the increased development. So if you had 1 house and you replace it with 3, you might get close to 3 times the capital value, especially if they're new build replacing an older build. So again, we're not saying that the low scenario, it will be what happens, but we would expect if bus rapid transit was to be implemented on the corridors above, you could sort of see this, a combination likely actually of these scenarios come together through land value uplift, through properties being redeveloped and through both the capital value and then the number of properties being the 2 key factors there. So this is really important for both the operational cost of bus rapid transit, so not only maintenance of the infrastructure, but then paying for the services, which falls in the regional council domain. So if you have a higher rates base within the walking catchment, the beneficiary area who are likely to be using the bus rapid transit directly, there are likely to be more people, more properties, and both commercial and residential paying in to helping keep those operational costs going. So we also touched on sort of that value.
So Malcolm, could we pause for a question? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Malcolm, can we go just back to that previous slide? So
Yep.
I'm just interested in those estimates. Are they just based on the extra number of dwellings? Because, as you pointed out somewhere in the, as it was pointed out somewhere in the memo, we have here, essentially land values increasing doesn't increase the overall pie for rates. It just changes how it's distributed. So I was just interested, does this rely on new tools, this analysis here, in terms of capturing that land value uplift, or what's it assuming?
Okay, I think there's kind of 2 components to that question. So this is really focused on the rates take. So what can you expect to see flow through to both councils from this sort of development scenario with bus rapid transit being implemented? So the combination of that. So the land value uplift is reflected in the overall capital value of each property. And that you would expect that to have some impact on rates. But I think the second component of your question is more around the value capture. So that's speaking to the earlier point of if you saw let's say a 5% increase in the land values around there, how would you capture that separately? So there's the impact on rates, and then there's the value capture. We're going to cover value capture and potential tools for that in a couple of slides.
But I think the point is to unlock that impact on rates, that would still require a council decision, right? Because of the way rates are set.
Okay, because I'm just trying to understand, say like a new ratepayer comes on board, that adds to the rates pool, but if it's the same property just going up in value, it doesn't add to the rates in any way. It just means everyone else's rates goes slightly down in proportion to that increase. So
Yes,
for example, if all the houses in Rototuna went up in value by 10%, but everyone else's values stayed the same, everyone in Rototuna pays a bit more, but everyone else in the rest of the city pays a little bit less. And so I'm just interested in your calculations here of the increase in rates take. Did it work on the assumption that, all of any increase in value ends up getting balanced out in the overall rates take?
So it worked on the impact within the corridor. So
This is the
And
potential.
yeah, this is the potential to increase from within the corridor. So yes, it doesn't balance to the overall council rates take. That would have to assume that you would be increasing to cover, the general inflation cost and various other initiatives that you might be wanting to do in an annual year or in a long-term plan decision. So it's looking at within the corridor rather than trying to account for the whole city, which would be a different exercise to undertake.
So absolutely required would. So this is just trying to show the potential of in changing the land use, increasing the intensification of development on these particular sites.
Okay, I'll take it offline in terms of just understanding it a little bit more, I think, because instead of holding everyone captive here.
Covered in the report with a stronger explanation and disclaimers in there. So we're also happy to discuss it offline, but yeah.
The idea is to very much show the potential. It is quite high level analysis just to show the potential of what the rates uplift could be on these properties.
Cool. So the next couple of slides, I'm going to hand over to Steph just to discuss, okay, what are the funding tools available, particularly with a value capture lens being applied, and then looking at the need and potential for financing the infrastructure cost.
Yeah, so as we've just kind of been covering off, you could make some assumptions about increasing the rates take across these properties if they're further developed. But then on top of that, you may look to use other tools, and those other tools are what we mean when we talk about value capture. And in terms of the policy coming out of central government, it's very much focused on what some of these other tools might be. We skipped forward a slide. What we've listed here on the right are tools that are probably familiar to many of you in terms of what's been talked about over the last few years about how we can actually use something different to capture the value. So the point here is council and potentially central government invest ratepayer and road user funding into a big piece of infrastructure such as a BRT that has a positive impact on the land value for some private property owners. Is it fair that they should actually share some of that uplift back with the council to contribute towards that overall cost and reduce the burden on the ratepayer? So overseas, this is used a lot. You might be familiar with the Hong Kong example, where they're the only metro system, public transport system in the world that self-funds because of the extent of value capture they're able to do. They're obviously a very different metro system as well, though, and their property values are incredibly high. This is also used, I worked in Canada and we used it a lot over there. The difference is that almost every other country around the world that uses land value uplift has a form of property tax. And so overseas, value capture is about ring fencing existing property taxes to then put into an infrastructure project. So when New Zealand and the central government politicians talk about using value capture, we are in quite a different context here because we don't have a similar property taxes. So what we need to do is, well, basically central government has looked at two things. One is legislation, and you guys can all take your own call about how likely it is that we'll get a capital gains tax in the future or not. But the other is looking at a suite of tools that could work as a proxy for value capture. So these tools would need to look at how much of the property value uplift could you attribute to the investment that was made in nearby infrastructure. And that's a bit of an art and a bit of a science. It's not an easy calculation to do, but there are some techniques that we try to do for that. So the ones that we've looked at are around whether you can use DCs in a different way to try and capture or ask developers to contribute to more of the cost of the infrastructure. There's the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act, which you may have looked at for some of your other projects. That's being reviewed at the moment by central government, and it is being looked at as how it can be used for value capture. IFF levies are actually pretty similar to a targeted rate in many ways, and so that of course would be another tool that could be used. And then the other piece, which is sort of where Auckland Light Rail landed, was the extent that you do just land purchase and resale. So actually council and Crown getting involved in urban development, that they capture that value directly. So those are the key tools that we've had a look at, and our report kind of goes into more detail about how they work and the pros and cons of each of them. And then, of course, you've got your standard funding tools, which are general rates, Crown grants, and your user pays through your bus fares. What I would say is value capture and bus fares are never going to get you all of the way there. They are just pieces to help contribute to the cost, and a piece of infrastructure like a BRT is always going to need a significant top up in terms of general rates and Crown grants.
I would add one note there, which is developer agreements, which currently sits in the other funding tools, could arguably also sit in the value capture proxies. If you were working with a large landowner who was the primary beneficiary of a section, maybe an extension of a bus rapid transit system, for example, let's say it's on the edge of the city, the bus rapid transit goes most of the way to the edge of the city, an extension of that line into their development, let's say it's a large one of at least a couple thousand houses, they would be the primary beneficiary of that. So you could enter into a developer agreement where they might cover most of the cost because it's going to enable them to build more houses, they'll see higher values, and they'll gain from it. But there might be some contribution still from the councils to cover part of the extension, recognising there is some local benefit. And again, this is the combination of things that would be likely required to help fund it.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly touch on financing. So it's pretty common globally that large public transport like this would have some private finance involved, just to try and smooth the cost more than anything else, smooth the big upfront cost. So if that's something that the councils are interested in, then obviously a couple of ways through that. One is just standard financing through our GFA, the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act, IFF, which I mentioned previously, that has a component in it which can be used for financing. And then you've got your PPPs and your concessions. The reason that we have had a look at this is this current set of ministers has made some pretty clear statements that they're trying to encourage private financing into infrastructure developments and transport developments. So it's worth thinking about. Ultimately, with a BRT, it all has to be paid back. So you really have to do the value for money testing to make sure that the cost of that private finance is worthwhile. But the benefit of it is that it spreads, these are long-term assets, intergenerational assets, and so it spreads the cost of that original build over those generations that will benefit from it. So we've got our report covers a bit more detail around the considerations for financing. The main thing that you really need to think about is having a really clear scope up front, and because finance loves certainty, and so being able to de-risk it and have efficient financing will come from having a really clear project up front and thinking about how you stage that project.
Awesome.
Excellent.
And then mindful of time, just to do a quick summary, is this helpful little diagram. So bus rapid transit alongside upzoning can create land value uplift on surrounding properties to a bus rapid transit line or lines system. On the funding tools side, there are proxies that can enable you to capture some of that value uplift from BRT, and that can help fund some of the infrastructure cost, which could also be financed. And then in the other spur there, there's the development scenario. So bus rapid transit can be key to supporting and encouraging higher density development and improving the rate space within that area, which can help cover the operational costs, both of operational costs of infrastructure as well as running the services for the regional council.
Brilliant. Thank you, Malcolm. Thank you, Stephanie. Have we got questions? Time for questions?
Yes,
Chair?
we have, and perhaps if I can just kick off with a question to either Stephanie or Malcolm. In terms of those proxies, though, it occurs to me that there would need to be, for them to be effective, legislative change, both in terms of development contributions, you've mentioned IFF levies, etc., etc. But those proxies seem to focus on those who are buying the new houses or apartments or whatever. The value capture doesn't seem to occur under the current legislative arrangements in terms of those who are benefiting from the increase in the value of their property. So it's probably what I'm feeling a bit challenged about, is in terms of there would need to be some significant legislative change so that we actually capture that value uplift properly and effectively, as opposed to it being left to those subsequent owners of houses and properties who, and in my experience in Tauranga, there's a limit in terms of IFF levies and targeted rates that can be imposed. So I'd just be interested in your comment on the most effective way in terms of utilising a value uplift approach.
No, completely agree that you need to make, if the intention is that you don't want people making super profits off ratepayer investment and that you want to capture some of that, we need to make sure it falls on the right people. IFF levies can be used, you can pick the date that it comes in, right? So you can, it's an annual charge, and so you can say it needs to come in prior to development potentially, if you think that the investment is already increasing the value of the land. The one thing I would say is really important and didn't happen with Auckland Light Rail, but is considered pretty seriously overseas in the UK, is the timing of the announcement of a project. Because if you come in and commit to saying, we're going to do BRT, and by the way, here are the stations and here's the route that we're planning, and then you come in 3 years later and say, we're going to do value capture on top of that, people have already captured the value, to be honest, and it's gone. So you need to be announcing your project, your commitment to a project and your routes and your stations at the same time as you're implementing your value capture plan.
And just to add to that answer, it doesn't require legislation change necessarily, though there is some refinements that could probably help make it easier. But both development, the IFF levy or a targeted rate could be an annual charge to help capture that value. That doesn't require a legislative change, and it doesn't just focus on when that property is transacted at a future date. It could be active and upfront in that you would expect that annual charge to be reflected in the property price, and people would be aware that, okay, I'm buying within this area, that means I'm going to have an annual charge for the next X many years to help fund that bus rapid transit.
Other questions? Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think, firstly, thank you for the work in the presentation. I do think that looking at the existing tools, essentially, for them to work, they really rely on people when they buy the property, fully taking into account future costs. For example, development contributions. We're currently subsidising development contributions to a huge amount in Hamilton because you've got situations where developers have bought property and then development contributions go up every 3 years. So after they've bought the property and taken into account what they thought DCs would cost, DCs go up, and then suddenly development's unfeasible and they're saying, well, you're not going to get any DC revenue from us because we'll do nothing. And so it's, and similarly with targeted rates, for example, you'd need, for it to work, you'd need people purchasing a property to go, I'm going to pay $50,000 less for this property because in the long run I'm going to be paying an extra $1,000 a year. Otherwise, you just end up with people paying a lot more to live in this area and the landowner having made a profit. You know, and so I agree that really the cleanest and best place to do a lot of this is where the, you know, landowners have actually getting that value uplift, where the landowners actually make that profit there. And we see that with our greenfield work as well. And PDAs only really work in a greenfield area because you've got only one or two landowners, you know, whereas in an urban area, you've got multiple landowners and lands entirely incredibly fragmented. And I think just coming back, I would really like some clarity around the rates take increase, because part of that will be, you know, an increase in the number of ratepayers and therefore an increase in rates on that land. And if it becomes more efficient to have more people in a condensed area, that becomes a good outcome for council. But with every new ratepayer, they also bring their own burden on the system. So it's to what extent is that outweighed through the efficient land use and servicing? And then, because equally you could have the same outcome in a, you know, in a paddock off to the side of the city. So the other thing is, have we considered, for example, if there is a corridor where values are going to go up, you know, a certain amount, could you cordon off? I mean, you'd need a legislative change, but you cordon off that area and you say this changes here will not affect the rates take in the rest of the city, so you don't end up with that being counterbalanced off, but you actually end up with an increased rates take because of that increased value. And it, you know, is that a pragmatic way of looking at it, so it actually increases your overall rates pool? Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, just to say, it was quite a small, very defined brief for KPMG in their defence. So we're straying into areas which are utterly valid and things we're going to talk about going forward. The brief that Paul, Stephanie and Malcolm had was very corridor constrained, and yeah, but great questions. This is exactly the debate I'd love these committees to have, actually. So.
And just as a comment, I've got a text from Robert, who had to leave the meeting online, but he's proposing a workshop for the Future Proof Implementation Committee, along with KPMG, on these very matters, because I think that would be beneficial in terms of time to delve into some of these matters. Any other questions or comments in terms of Stephanie or Malcolm at this point? Don't appear to be. Phil, anything you'd like to add before we get to the recommendation to receive the
No, just really appreciate the opportunity to present this, and great to hear the discussion. So thank you.
And thank you both for the input and the contribution and the response. Much appreciated.
If I just had one thing to add, it would be it's lovely to have these conversations. It just shows that we are a growing city. We're tackling these big problems. We're doing it 10 years in advance. So it's actually quite reassuring, and it's kind of, for me, why this committee's here. You know. Thanks.
Okay. There's no further comments or questions. And as I said, we will in another forum. We will come back, because equally it's very germane in terms of growth areas and PDAs, etc., etc.
Yeah. Is it possible to get a copy of that report? I know it's sort of city specific, but it's a good report.
Your officers probably already do have a copy, but I can certainly get one available to you this afternoon. Yeah. Yep, no problem. Okay.
So on page 55, recommendation. Oh, sorry. There is a recommendation on page 55, but on the screen, there's to receive the report and the request in terms of considering the findings of scoping out the next phases of the bus rapid transport investigations across the proposed corridors. They're the two recommendations. And again, they'll come back, but certainly that ability in terms of the connection between the future-proof public transport subcommittee work and the wider future-proof, and making sure we've got some good alignment across the two. And that certainly was Robert's interest. So. Okay, moved by Angela S. If I can have a seconder for that. Thanks, Roger. There's nothing further. I'll put those two recommendations. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. And also, and thanks, Phil, because it's a fascinating topic that I think further discussions will certainly be of benefit as we work through that concept. And I think the interesting thing is also the timing in terms of announcement of projects and then value capture arrangements and funding and all of that. So I think that's highlighted for me the criticality of that alignment too. Okay, so we'll now move back to item 7.5, the freight strategy, Phil. Yes.
Sorry, I'm at your mercy here in terms of timing. I'm conscious there's another presentation after this, so I'll go through quickly some of the key points and some context. So again, this is one of the projects that was seen as a priority to do when we did the original transport program business case. And I think if you think about some of the projects that we've presented to you in the past, particularly around the bus rapid transit, and some of the corridors that we've identified, look at this as part of that bigger picture. Look at it in terms of the way that we need to sort of prioritise some decisions around how we use our road space going forward, and some of the decisions we have to make around, do we have a freight priority, do we have a PT priority, or something else along some of the key corridors that are being identified. And I think I was challenged by my own councillors this week on what some of those, spatially, what some of those corridors are, in terms of where a freight and a PT focus is starting to align. And a really good example I always use is the route between Frankton and Ruakura and Anglesey Street as an obvious one where there are conflicts, but there are opportunities as well. And going back to Auckland Transport, there are ways that they're dealing with these very issues as well that I'm keeping an eye on. So this study was undertaken and concluded in August this year. It was handy for Hamilton City Council because we needed to update our own guidance around freight, but we wanted to put a bit of a future-proof spin on it. So there are, outside of some of the, I guess, more traditional things you'd expect a freight study to look at, or, where are our big trucks going? What are the problems? We wanted to have a look at, are some of our future funding proposals aligned to our employment growth areas? Obviously, Ruakura stands out as a big one. How we can align with national policy? How can we look at new emerging trends? We even looked at drone use and things like that. And also we tried to put a bit more of a land use perspective on it, in sort of recognition that the logistics chain, the way things are done around the country is changing, particularly in the use of smaller vehicle types and more localised distribution centres. I had a little bit of an experience in Auckland where you'll find around Auckland city centre, small distribution hubs that are served by small vehicles that are actually the last point of mode is a cargo bike. So, we're getting down to that level, and there's been some really good examples in Auckland and Wellington where that actually does happen. So if it can happen there, it can happen here. So briefly, we wanted to look at challenges and opportunities. We wanted to look at, the pace of change, and we wanted to hear from the people that actually used our networks to do their daily freight and logistics work. So a big part of the work we did was understanding not just maybe some industry best practice, but also we did a comprehensive engagement with industry members. So we did canvass members of the Transport Working Group and NZTA on around some of the people you'd like us to speak to. So I remember Brian Hudson from Wiper was keen that we engage with the quarry industry. We had a lot of smaller operators within Hamilton. We had the big ones as well. So we went down to Ruakura and we spoke to Big Chill and Main Freight and Kmart. Obviously, we had a lot of engagement with Tainui, obviously, as the owner down there. And we obviously focused on places like Horatu, Crawford. We had a look at some of the future proposals that were already in place around road and rail. And also at the back of this work was the objective that we set ourselves a couple of years ago to try and increase the way that we did increase the rail freight over road. That was a big part of, again, we talked about problems in the PPC from 2 years ago. That was one of the challenges, one of the KPIs we set ourselves. So again, we got some really good insights into that, and it's not as easy as it sounds. So maybe if we can go on to the next slide, please, Brooke. I am going to go through this because I stupidly haven't got it in front of me. But so we did do this literature research. That's a separate report which all your officers have got. Now, one of the key things, and especially given that we've actually got a much better access to data these days, was a bit of a look at the current situation. Obviously, post-WEX, things have changed. No surprises there where our main freight is using the WEX now. And we also had a bit of a stab at, in 30 years' time, what we're going to needing to be preparing for. And that's where things like the Frankton to Ruakura routes and the Anglesey routes started to really show, in terms of future trends. And again, probably the stakeholder engagement might be of the most interest to people. And again, there's a whole separate report that the staff have got that goes through a series of focus groups and surveys, and I think 10 specific interviews with the Tainuis, the Big Chills, the Kmarts, and also some very small local operators who provided some fantastic insight, by the way, that can help in our planning. We have a series of recommendations. So we've basically done them in the 10-year and the 30-year, I believe, timescales. Now, a lot of those will focus around asset management, where we need to make sure our pavements are big enough and strong enough for future vehicles, but also how we need to influence future district plans in terms of some of those land use concerns I just talked about, and also how we manage our curbside space. So this is loading and servicing. They were obviously big issues for some of the smaller operators. And we started to look at how some of the things we're finding around the freight study outcomes, particularly on a network perspective, is identifying those clashes and conflicts with some of our future PT routes, but also our walking and cycling routes, and those high dimension vehicle routes. So sometimes they're actually an opportunity because it does show that corridors do need specific treatments. So if you look at places in Auckland, for instance, they are introducing, managed lanes that are not just your T2s and T3s, but they're actually freight and bus lanes, those sorts of things. So for me, that's useful info as part of our transition to BRT on some of our core corridors. And we did try and take, obviously, a bit of a future-proof lens as well, noting that most of the feedback we got from the industry was Hamilton-centric. It was focused around Ruakura and Horatu and some of the key intersections. It did give us guidance. There was a very strong, you need to fund the ETC, and that did come through in central government funding as well. And if maybe we go on to the next slide, Brooke. I can't read that stupidly, but oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. There's a slide here that just maps some of those early recommendations, and Councillor, I'm very happy, obviously, to share all this as well afterwards. But so yeah, some of those focuses were around the links from the WEX into Ruakura, and very consistent with the long-term aspirations to maintain our network around there. There was directions around what we call the Central City Connector alignment into Frankton. Again, it's one of our main BRT routes as well. Thanks. There was a lot of conversation around the development of the rail connection at Karakiā. And then we had sort of other non-sort of capital type recommendations around managing peak time traffic demands, trying to flatten the peak was the term that our consultants used, give more priority to freight movements during peak times. And then there were some really very expensive high-level rail options around developing links between the existing rail hubs and just ongoing improvements around infrastructure within places like Ruakura. And if we jump quickly onto the next slide, you'll see a pattern really very similar to PT Pathways, a pattern of investigation and design moving to more of a longer term implementation around some network improvements. And again, Tarapa Road falls out of that one because of the planned growth in the future and the fact that if you're going to be doing something for the BRT network in that time period, you're going to want to do something for the freight as well. So again, similar to PT Pathways, from a freight perspective, this brings in where we need to consider the freight element in our future PT network development and our future transport network development. And I think this is a point that our mayor picked up really well in our internal briefing at Hamilton City this week when we talked about this project, the fact that we're not just talking about a single mode, even though this is a freight study, we've also done some work to demonstrate this is a key public transport corridor as well. So there is a design solution there, but we know it's a problem, we need to plan for it. So again, I think this is where the MSP program does show some of its benefits, and these projects do align. I'll probably leave it there actually, shall I? Yeah. It's a very comprehensive piece of work. It's a very technical piece of work. It is available for everyone around the table. And again, it's part of the evidence base. It's part of helping you decide your LTP decisions in the future. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Any questions or comments around the table? And certainly, I think in terms of this work also being a key input into the work that Future Proof looking at doing in terms of the Hamilton Tauranga corridor. So again, informing some of that work that is undertaken in the future. Roger.
Yes. Hang on now, I don't know how to use this.
Yep, you're right.
Although that's focused very much metropolitan city area,
Yeah.
I can see a lot of relevance of what you've talked about there to Cambridge and the growth of Hautap, because we're already seeing that freight corridor that's generated by Hautap is having quite a considerable impact. So I think it's very relevant that I'll take this back and just pop it on the table and let folks have a look at it, because I think it is relevant to us as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it was meant to have a metro area spin to it. Obviously, it does get a bit Hamilton centric. It should already be on your table, so I have a word with Brian.
Any other questions or comments? Here to be any? So thanks very much, Phil, and thanks for presenting on that. And up on the screen are two recommendations, one to receive the report and requesting the work. Oh, sorry, Angus.
Apologies, I was a bit too slow on hitting the raise button. I just wanted to acknowledge the work that your team's done, Nigel. It is comprehensive, that's the word you used. The summaries you found on the rail side of things are accurate and really well informed. Those comments about Karakiā and the development potential around Ruakura are fantastic. You've done a really good job, so I just wanted to give you guys a shout out. It's a very important corridor for us, and because of it being important to us, it's a very important corridor for the country. So yeah, just a good bit of work, so thank you.
No, thanks for those comments, Angus.
Yeah, thanks, Angus.
And then Recommendation 2, requesting the Transport Working Group work with the City Council on incorporating the recommendations from the study into the Metro Spatial Plan Transport Program priority project. So I can have someone move and second those. Thanks, Sarah. Seconder, Eugene. There's no further discussion. I'll put that. All those in favour say aye. Against? Carried. So we move on to the last item on the agenda, and that's 7.7, the operations report, and we've got Vincent and Trudy. So welcome to you both. And you are now between the committee having lunch. So over to both of you.
Good morning, Chair and committee members. So Trudy and I here today to talk about the PT operations update report. So with your permission, Chair, I would like to take the report as read.
Yes.
And we'll just draw your attention to some of the key highlights from the report. So the report covers all the operational performance for public transport service within the future-proof sub-region over the Q3 this year. In general, we're very pleased with the strong performance, this patronage performance for this quarter, despite the fact that we had introduced the 20% fee increase and removed the age-based concessions, as well as having 2 school holidays falling within this quarter. So overall, I think the patronage performance has been very strong for this quarter. We are seeing 17.8% growth for Q3 this year compared to Q3 last year, which is a very encouraging sign. We are also seeing a similar level of growth for Te Huia and Flex on-demand services with 20% increase and 15% increase respectively. With the increased patronage, we are also seeing fee revenue gone up by 25% across rail and bus services. So in terms of the travel time reliability, it has been very steady over Q3 this year. And for Eastern Connector, based on the staff analysis, we've found the actual runtime is quicker than the scheduled bus timetable, resulting in the service arriving early all the time. So we have introduced a new timetable to make sure the timetable matches the actual runtime. So we'll expect to see the travel time performance pick up for Eastern Connector in Q4 in the next report. So I guess overall the trend has been very positive across our network over the last 3 quarters. So we are tracking at delivering a 20% sort of patronage increase for the whole calendar year, which is quite a major achievement for the region. And the report also contains a lot more detail in terms of the network performances and analysis, and I'm happy to take questions on anything contained in the report.
Okay, no, thank you. Trudy, anything to add before I open it up? Okay. Okay, Sarah.
Cool. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Vincent and Trudy. I just have one question around reliability. Worst thing is when you turn up and your bus doesn't turn up. So the reliability stuff here shows us that, you know, whether it's late or early, but they're like easy to digest stats around how many times, you know, how frequently a bus just doesn't.
Yes, so we do have the data showing whether the bus is arriving early or late. So we can, I guess, provide that next level of details. Because with bus arriving early, normally what happened was the bus will wait at the timing point anyway. So there was no kind of real impact to the passengers, but it's still showing on the stats. So it's kind of skewed in terms of the bus travel time reliability result.
I think what's helpful is to look at it from like a user perspective. What's really annoying is if it arrives early and leaves early before, you know, but then a lot of the time, so I've had experiences using the app and you can see the bus and it'll go have a little dot traveling and then the dot disappears and no bus arrived. And I don't know what's happened, but yeah, Jen's saying, yes, I've had that too. So it's, I've had experiences on too many occasions where you've been waiting and gone, okay, this is a 15-minute service and I have been here for 20 minutes and no bus has arrived at all. So and that's like one of the things that will put people, the biggest thing in my view, which when someone uses the bus will put them off using it again, is if it doesn't turn up. And the other thing is if it turns up full and then you have to wait for another cycle. So to understand the reliability from the user perspective would be really helpful, like what matters most in this. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. A disgruntled bus pass.
Angela. Oh.
Clarify, there have been many times when the bus has arrived, so thank you.
Angela.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to also talk about the performance measures as well. I know that, as an aside, Vincent, you answered some questions through our annual plan reporting. And can you just talk me through how we're going to measure, say, the metro buses compared to those satellite town buses? Is that measure going to change moving forward, given, the distances that our satellite town buses cover are greater, and perhaps have that more variability? Just thinking, someone outside looking in, we're sort of sitting 60% or reliability. It doesn't look good from a perception point of view. So I'm just wondering if our measures are quite right to actually reflect, all things considered, with the odd bus coming early or not turning up, that, does it truly reflect the service that we are offering?
Yes. So in terms of the travel time reliability measures, it's defined as 1 minute early or 5 minutes late. So anything, if the service arriving outside of this time frame, it's considered reliable. So I think it's kind of a one size fits all at the moment. Like, so we use this measure across all our services. But I think this measure will be applicable or appropriate for urban context. For some of the regional long distance services, like when you imagine they're traveling more than 90K with very limited stops, so you need to have a bit more tolerance in terms of travel time variability. So that's something we're looking at in terms of introducing different set of criteria or measures, regional services, so that the measures actually fit for purpose. And for some of the regional services, what we found was in most cases they are arriving early, not late. So because of the travel conditions. So again, that's the other thing we can look at, if we can provide further detail in terms of separating the late versus early, so people can understand the context a bit more. And just going back to your comments around the annual plan sort of targets, I don't think we can change the performance measure, but I think for the commentary, I think what we want is to actually provide a bit more details in terms of being providable analysis to show that actually there's different sort of nuances in terms of different type of services.
Yeah, that's great. Probably for this one, I'm also thinking more forward to the next period as well, just so it is a true reflection alongside that narrative as well. So yeah, hope that makes sense.
Yes, and I think we also spoke to NZTA about this issue. So I think this is also an issue picked up at the national level. I think each region have a different set of performance measures for travel time reliability, and sometimes definition is very different. So I think that's one of the work that NZTA is looking at to standardize the performance measure for travel time.
No further questions around the table? There's nothing online.
Just one thing further.
Angela.
Just the usual request, I suppose, for there's quite good stats, up 20% as well. How are we telling our great news story to our users and non-users.
Rudy, you're poised.
Thank you, Councillor Strange. In response, look, we do have a specific marketing campaign for the year, and that has lots of pockets that are recognising these achievements that we're making. I guess a couple of things to call out is, for example, the Meteor and the 100,000th passenger, and there's other things we're doing, I guess, with Te Huia, and yes, this committee report has also been inclusive of all of that sort of customer interaction and other channels that we're really utilising more so than ever now, and a lot of that messaging that's going through those channels is sort of specific to promoting the services and some of the good news stories that we have, as well as in and amongst the communities and some of that storytelling, if that makes sense.
Here, Adrian.
Yeah, thanks. Just one question just around what's driving the low reliability rate for the Eastern Connect? Because it's fairly consistent, it's sitting around that 30 to 40. So can you expand on why it's not lifting to 50? Turn mine off.
So I think it's noted in the report. I think it's really down to how we design our timetable. So the actual runtime is much faster than the timetable. So that for us is easy fix. We can kind of tweak our timetable to match up the actual runtime. But for other routes, there might be different reasons, whether it's a network issues or there could be a boarding, like there's a increased patronage, slowing down the travel time. There's different factors going into.
So is it patronage because of the number of stops around town, you know, whether it's stopping and starting? Is there a bit of that that's making it run early? Because how many is, you know, because there's quite a few bus stops in Matamata itself. And I do wonder whether there's too many, because there's some that are very close together that sort of think why. So there's an opportunity perhaps to consider the number of stops maybe if it's not, I don't know. But I do recall reading that now. So they have been coming earlier than late. Yep. That's the arrival. Perfect. No, that's good. Just to get my head around that. Thank you.
Chair Pamela.
Kia ora. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Fantastic to see these statistics, and just, I suppose, wanting to acknowledge the increase in patronage despite the fare increase. I know that was something we were all concerned about, and so it is really positive to see that people still value this service even at a higher fare box recovery price point. So so cool to see that. And just while I can I also acknowledge the PT customer focus team, which was recently recognized in the Hamilton Central Business Awards with a highly commended or special recognition. So just while we were talking about performance of the team, just a shout out. Well done.
Okay. Thank you. And I think it's a good note to actually end the meeting on in terms of such a positive vein. So thank you, Vincent. Thanks, Trudy. And thanks for the positive report and the increase in patronage, and picking up Chair Pamela's point, despite the increase in the fare box. Yes. So before you, there's a recommendation to receive the report. If I can have someone to, Chair Pamela's moved, someone to second that. Mayor Adrian, I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Well, that concludes our meeting, and I'd just like to thank everyone for your input and contribution. It's one thing about this committee, there is never any shortage of thinking and questions and commentary on the table, but that's part of the role of the committee and key to that sort of probing and understanding the raft of matters that come before us. So on that note, Phil, would you like to close us with a karakia, please?
Of course. Unahia, unahia mai te uru tapu nui, kia wātia, kia mama, nākau te tinana, te hininaro, i te arataku tū. Koe rā e rongo e whakaarea ake ki runga, kia tina, tina, umie, uie, tākie. Thanks.
Meeting closed. Thanks, everyone. And there's lunch for everyone in the adjacent tui room. Thanks, Brooke. Too bad, was it? Yeah.
Shut me up at my meeting, eh? Good.